One of the central questions that we'll be addressing this evening is, can India's rural economy be an engine for growth? Now, why would that be important? As the world economy slows down and as India's economy also takes a bit of a hit, we're all looking for engines for economic growth. These issues are not academic. They affect millions of lives. And they affect, if we look at India, we have 800 million people living in rural India. And the standards of living are not very high, and it impacts all of us. So some of the thoughts that we'll be looking at, some of the ideas that we'll be looking at this evening, and I invite you to co-create with me. They say that no idea is so good that it cannot be improved upon, or so bad that it cannot be used as a stepping stone to better ideas. So I'd like to share with you a set of ideas that I'd written about around 20 years ago. These, as in the introduction it was mentioned, that they are in the syllabus of a law school. Now, what we'll be looking at is, if you look at India's economy, we have 800 million people. India has basically two different financial markets, and they're very different. The modern financial sector, where we operate, we can get access to credit at about 10 or 15%. If you use a credit card, maybe 24%, 36%. The person who delivers vegetables to you every day borrows 90 rupees in the morning and has to pay back 100 rupees in the evening. Now, if you calculate the interest, that comes to about 11% per day. And if it's annualized, this works out to several thousand% per day. This is a very, very high rate of interest. It does not lend itself to capital formation or to building prosperity. So my dream for India is, can we reduce interest rates for 800 million people? Can we bring down the interest rates to levels that are similar to what urban Indians pay when they borrow money? Now, one of the impacts of this would be that we can have a lot more enterprise. We can have a lot more, as we saw earlier, we can have more entrepreneurs. When you start an enterprise and you don't have to borrow money at several thousand%, your enterprise has a greater chance of success. One of the problems we have in India is that you have a lot of bonded labor. You have farmers committing suicide. Unfortunately, even in Gujarat, which is a prosperous state, across the country you have a lot of debt. If we can bring down interest rates, some of these problems can be addressed. Dr. Mahmood Yunus, the founder of the Grameen Bank, has gone on record to say that access to inexpensive credit is a fundamental human right. In places where we have very high rates of interest, it is very difficult for businesses to survive. People have to, they have difficulty, making ends meet. Now, how can we bring down interest rates in rural India, where 800 million people live currently in 600,000 villages? How can we bring interest rates down to levels that are similar to urban India? And I think the first thing we need to do on this journey is to re-look at the institutional structure for rural banking. When India got its independence from Britain in 1947, we unthinkingly decided to adapt the banking structures that were predominant in Great Britain. There are a few interesting differences between Great Britain and India. One is, Britain is a fairly small country compared to India. They don't have vast geographical expanses, whereas in India you have scattered communities, 600,000 villages across vast expanses of land. So in Britain, the banking system that sort of predominated was a branch banking system which lended itself to the kind of geography that Britain has. India, I believe, needs a different institutional structure for rural banking. And I'll be addressing this. If you look at the United States, the kind of banking system that has predominated, think back to the United States 200 years ago. You had communities that were isolated in a geography that was fairly expansive, not very different from where India is today. The banking structure that the United States decided to adopt was something called the unit bank, where you had all the functions of a bank located in a single office. Right? And none of the services of banks were, all the banking through a system of correspondent banks. You could actually, customers could get all the benefits of a banking system through these unit banks. Now, how did these unit banks evolve? They evolved because people would tend to go to their local grocer and take credit from the grocer. Right? And if they had, so the local grocer merchant also developed banking-like functions, eventually also taking deposits. Now, this is, if you look at rural India today, our institutions are very similar, not dissimilar to what the United States had 200 years ago. Now, please note one huge advantage of a unit banking system. If there is a bank failure, it does not cause a catastrophic collapse of the entire economy. I mean, if you have only a few large, well-entrenched banks in an economy and some of them fail, like a Lehman Brothers, etc., it can cause serious damage to the entire economy. Whereas if you have unit banks, you don't have this damage. Right, so the next thing I think we need to do is look at the institutional structure. How do we get unit banks into 600,000 villages? The answer is India's banking system is at least 5,000 years old. If you look at the writings of Manu, you'll find that banks have existed. Even today, banking functions exist in rural India. In the informal financial sector, in every village you have, despite all the invasions, despite droughts, famines, etc., the banking in rural India has survived and has grown. By some estimates, there is a Shroff committee report that estimates that about 89% of India's banking needs are met by the informal sector. Now, we know that there is a demand in India, in the banking sector, is cyclical. The demand increases when crops need to be moved from farms to markets. So now the basic problem is that you have two very different sectors. You have a formal financial sector and an informal financial sector. At the center of the formal financial sector, you have the Reserve Bank. Now, theoretically, the writ of the Reserve Bank governor should run across the country to all Indians. Unfortunately, it does not. The writ of the Reserve Bank governor only runs to the major metropolitan centers and does not really, the RBI does not affect interest rates for 800 million Indians. Now, what I have suggested in my writings, and I'm writing a book about this, is if we can create a new institutional mechanism, a refinance market that can bridge the modern and traditional financial sectors, and you allow market mechanisms to play out, interest rates will drop. Now, I'm just going to very quickly, in the time that's remaining, take you through an interesting idea, and that is, in order to have an effective credit delivery system, we need to have three things. The first is affordable credit in adequate quantities and with timely decisions. Now, the formal and informal sectors have a very interesting symmetry. In the formal sector, you have affordable credit. In the informal sector, credit is very expensive. In the second criteria, the formal sector will only give you about 80% of what you need. So if you start a project requiring about 1 crore of rupees, you'll only get 80 lakhs. In my opinion, you are setting up the seeds, you're setting your enterprise up for failure right at the very beginning. You're creating a non-performing asset by undercapitalizing many projects right at the very beginning. In the informal sector, will be happy to lend you as much money as you need. The only problem is the interest rates are very high. The third is timely decisions. If you go to a bank in the formal sector, you will be charged, decisions will take, months maybe. By that time, your project costs will escalate, and you'll have a non-performing asset. In the informal sector, decisions are very quick. Knowing your customer is not an issue. Now, if you take a look at these 3 criteria, we find that the informal sector has strengths in 2, and the formal sector has strengths in 1, the cost of the credit. Now, if we can bring down the cost of credit from several thousand% to, let's say, 10 or 15% for all Indians, what impact would this have on the Indian economy? Yeah, we know that every time the monsoon fails, the stocks of, let's say, Hindustan Lever takes a hit. So we cannot, I'll just leave you with one thought. You cannot have national development without rural development. We'd end up with having islands of prosperity in an ocean of poverty, and this is not sustainable. There are solutions I would invite you to explore. There is a website, imonghosh.com. There's a free resources link. If you're interested, I invite you to take a look. Thank you very much.